It wasn't a press conference or a palace decree that shook the future of the monarchy. It was a single, quiet question from a child. Asked in a private moment, far from cameras and ceremony, Prince George's words reportedly stopped Prince William cold. Those present say the room fell silent. Because what George asked wasn't innocent curiosity, it touched something the royal family had spent years trying to contain. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It unfolded not in grandeur, but in the kind of quiet moment that usually passes unnoticed of father and son, alone, away from the careful choreography of royal life. Yet insiders suggest that even within those private walls, nothing about this exchange felt ordinary. George, still so young yet already positioned at the center of a centuries-old institution, is said to have asked a question that cut through layers of protocol, expectation, and carefully managed narratives. Reports suggest it wasn't just what he asked, but how he asked it: calm, direct, almost as if he already understood the weight behind his words. And in that instant, something shifted. Those close to the household whisper that William's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. He didn't deflect. He didn't laugh it off. Instead, there was a pause, a long, heavy silence that seemed to stretch far beyond the room itself. Different interpretations of that moment describe the same unsettling detail. William appeared visibly shaken. Not dramatically, not in a way that would ever surface in public, but enough that those nearby recognized it as unusual. This is a man trained from birth to control his emotions, to carry the burden of the crown with composure and restraint. And yet, for a brief moment, that composure faltered. Some insiders claim that Catherine, Princess of Wales, positioned just beyond the immediate exchange, caught enough of the conversation to understand its gravity. She is said to have stepped in subtly afterward, not to interrupt, but to steady the atmosphere, to protect the space in which that question had been asked. Because what George had done, perhaps, without fully realizing it, was open a door that had long been kept firmly closed. Palace aides, often the first to sense shifts in tone and tension, reportedly noticed the change almost immediately. Conversations grew quieter. Movements became more deliberate. It is whispered in administrative corridors that a ripple effect began that same evening, subtle but undeniable. William was later seen with George again, this time in a more composed setting, offering comfort in a way that seemed both reassuring and deeply reflective. Those familiar with the family's routines suggest that such moments are carefully managed, yet this one carried a different weight, as if the future itself had briefly stepped into the present and demanded acknowledgement. And then came the part that rarely happens. The question didn't disappear. It didn't remain confined to that private exchange. Instead, it began to circulate quietly, carefully, but persistently among senior staff. Not in full detail, never explicitly stated, but enough to create a shared understanding that something significant had occurred. Media insiders, often attuned to shifts long before they surface publicly, would later hint that something was off within the household for weeks. At the time, it was dismissed as routine speculation. Now, those same whispers are being revisited with a new sense of urgency, as if this single moment has begun to connect dots that were previously scattered and unclear. What makes this all the more compelling is not just the secrecy surrounding it, but the recognition that this was not an isolated incident. Sources close to the inner workings of the royal household suggest that George has, in recent months, begun asking more questions that go beyond childhood curiosity and into the realm of understanding his place within something far larger than himself. And while such curiosity might be expected, the timing, the tone, and the reaction it provoked have turned this particular moment into something far more consequential. Because within the structure of the monarchy, moments like this are never just moments, they are signals. Signals that something is shifting beneath the surface, something that cannot be easily controlled or contained. And so, what began as a quiet exchange between father and son has now taken on a life of its own, echoing through corridors that rarely allow such echoes to linger. It has forced those closest to the crown to confront a reality that has long been managed with precision. That the next generation is no longer simply being prepared, it is beginning to question. And in a system built on continuity, tradition, and unspoken understanding, a question like this carries a power that is both subtle and profound. Because once asked, it cannot be unheard. Once acknowledged, it cannot be ignored. But what made the question so unsettling wasn't just its timing, it was what it revealed about what George had already begun to understand. From the outside, his life appears carefully protected: school runs, football matches, quiet smiles. But insiders suggest Prince George's world has never been ordinary. Behind palace walls, he has been raised not just as a child, but as a future king. And recently, something changed, something that made that reality impossible to ignore. What the public sees is carefully measured simplicity, a life designed to appear grounded and familiar. Yet those who understand the inner workings of the monarchy suggest that beneath that calm surface lies a structure far more rigid, far more demanding. From an early age, George has been positioned within a framework that does not allow for complete innocence. Reports suggest that even the smallest routines, where he stands, how he listens, what he observes, carry subtle layers of preparation. Not overt, never forceful, but constant. Because within the monarchy, preparation does not begin with a formal announcement, it begins quietly, shaping a child long before he fully understands what is being shaped. Those familiar with the household whisper that in recent months, this quiet preparation has begun to evolve. It is no longer just about observation. It is becoming awareness. George, once shielded from the deeper complexities of royal life, is now said to be encountering fragments of its reality in ways that cannot be easily simplified. Small details, subtle conversations, moments where explanations are no longer enough to satisfy curiosity. And with each of those moments, something shifts, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed by those paying close attention. At the center of this delicate balance stands Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose role has long been defined by her ability to bridge two worlds. On one side, the relentless expectations of the crown. On the other, the need to preserve a sense of normalcy for her children. Insiders suggest that this balance has become increasingly difficult to maintain. Because as George grows, the questions become more complex, the answers more fragile. Catherine is said to approach these moments with care, offering reassurance while quietly navigating the boundaries of what can be explained and what must remain unspoken. It is a delicate dance, one that requires both honesty and restraint. Meanwhile, Prince William is believed to carry a different kind of weight. For him, this is not just about guiding his son, it is about confronting his own experience, his own understanding of what it means to inherit a role that cannot be refused. Reports suggest that he has become increasingly aware that George is no longer simply absorbing information, he is interpreting it, questioning it, and perhaps most significantly, beginning to connect it to himself. This realization, subtle as it may seem, carries a profound implication. Because once a child begins to see their future clearly, even in fragments, the illusion of choice begins to fade. Palace administrative circles, often sensitive to shifts that never reach the public eye, have reportedly taken note of this transition. There are whispers of internal discussions, not formal meetings, but quiet exchanges about how George should be guided moving forward, how much he should be told, how much he should discover on his own. Because the challenge is no longer just about preparation, it is about timing. Introduce too much too soon, and the weight becomes overwhelming. Hold back too much, and the moment of realization becomes abrupt, even destabilizing. And it is within this growing tension that a pattern begins to emerge. Insiders claim that George has started asking questions that go beyond surface-level curiosity. Not frequent, not relentless, but precise. Focused, questions that suggest he is beginning to see beyond the carefully constructed narrative that surrounds him. Each question, on its own, might seem harmless. But together, they form something more, a quiet signal that the next generation is no longer passively receiving its role. It is beginning to examine it. This is where the shift becomes impossible to ignore. Because the monarchy has always relied on continuity, on the seamless passing of responsibility from one generation to the next. It depends on acceptance, on the understanding that duty is not chosen, but inherited. Yet when questions begin to surface, especially from someone at the very center of that inheritance, the dynamic changes. It introduces uncertainty into a system built on certainty. And while that uncertainty may remain contained for now, its presence alone is enough to unsettle those who understand what is at stake. And according to those closest to the family, This wasn't the first question, but it was the first one that forced William to confront something he had been avoiding. To understand why the question struck so deeply, one must look at the burden Prince William carries, a legacy shaped by loss, expectation, and unfinished tensions. Because the future George is stepping into isn't just ceremonial, it's layered with history, conflict, and sacrifice. Long before he was guiding a son through the early shadows of royal responsibility, William himself stood at the center of a story that never truly settled. It is often said, in quiet royal circles, that his understanding of duty was not formed in comfort, but in fracture. The legacy of Princess Diana still lingers not as a distant memory, but as a defining force that shaped how he sees the institution he is destined to lead. Reports suggest that from a young age, William became acutely aware of the contrast between public expectation and private reality. The world saw a future king, but behind that image was a boy navigating grief, scrutiny, and a growing awareness that the crown demands far more than it reveals. As he matured, that awareness did not fade, it hardened. Those familiar with his journey often describe it as a quiet transformation, one where emotion was gradually replaced by resolve. Because within the monarchy, there is an unspoken rule that governs everything. Duty comes first. Not sometimes. Not when convenient. Always. It is a principle that has been passed down through generations, reinforced not through words alone, but through example, sacrifice, and, at times, painful compromise. William absorbed that lesson fully. Insiders suggest that he came to understand, perhaps earlier than most, that being heir is not about choice. It is about acceptance. Yet acceptance does not erase conflict. In fact, it often deepens it. The modern monarchy, shaped by media scrutiny and shifting public expectations, has created pressures that previous generations never faced in quite the same way. William's path to the throne is not unfolding in isolation. It is being observed, analyzed, and questioned at every step. Every decision, every gesture, every silence carries meaning. And within that constant exposure lies a tension that is impossible to ignore. Because while the crown demands stability, the world surrounding it is constantly changing. This tension extends beyond public perception and into the very fabric of the royal family itself. Reports have long suggested that internal dynamics have not always been seamless. Differences in approach, in values, in understanding what the monarchy should represent, these are not new challenges, but they have become more pronounced in recent years. For William, navigating these complexities has required a careful balance. He must honor tradition while quietly adapting to a new era. He must uphold the institution while protecting those closest to him from its harsher realities. And perhaps most significantly, he must do all of this while preparing the next generation to step into roles that cannot be fully explained until they are lived. It is within this context that his relationship with George takes on a deeper meaning. Because William's desire to protect his children is not abstract, it is deeply personal. Those close to the family suggest that he is determined to offer them something he himself rarely had: a sense of normalcy, a space where they can grow without the full weight of expectation pressing down too soon. But that protection has limits. The structure of the monarchy does not allow for complete distance. At some point, reality must be introduced. And when it is, it does not arrive gently. This is where the internal conflict begins to surface most clearly. William stands at the intersection of two powerful forces. On one side, the tradition that has defined his life, demanding continuity and unwavering commitment. On the other, a growing awareness that the world his children are inheriting is different, more questioning, more open, less willing to accept things without understanding them. Bridging that gap is not simple. It requires decisions that carry long-term consequences, choices that may redefine how the monarchy evolves in the years to come. And so, when George asked his question, it did not exist in isolation. It connected directly to everything William has carried for years: the expectations, the sacrifices, the unresolved tensions that have shaped his journey. It forced him, even if only for a moment, to confront the possibility that the path ahead may not be as straightforward as it once seemed. Because if the next generation begins to question what has always been accepted, then the very foundation of that acceptance begins to shift. Which is why George's question didn't just echo in the present, it reopened something from William's past that had never fully settled. Reports differ. Some say it was simple. Others say it was devastatingly precise. But all accounts agree on one thing: Prince George's question cut straight to the core of what it means to be heir to the throne. Those familiar with the inner rhythms of the royal household suggest that the exact wording may never be publicly known, and perhaps that is part of what gives the moment its power. Because when something remains just out of reach, it invites interpretation. It invites quiet reconstruction. And in this case, the interpretations themselves are revealing. Some insiders whisper that George's question centered on duty, whether it is something a person chooses or something that is simply placed upon them. Others suggest it went even further, touching on sacrifice, on what must be given up in order to carry the crown. And then there are those who claim it was framed in the simplest possible terms, almost disarmingly so, yet carrying an implication that could not be ignored. Do I have to do this? It is that underlying theme, the tension between choice and obligation, that appears to have struck most deeply. Because within the monarchy, this question is rarely asked aloud. It exists, certainly, beneath the surface, woven into the experience of every heir. But it is not something that is encouraged, not something that is explored openly. The institution relies on continuity, on acceptance, on the quiet understanding that the role is inherited, not negotiated. And yet, here it was, voiced not by an adult navigating complexity, but by a child just beginning to understand what lies ahead. Reports suggest that Prince William's reaction was immediate, though controlled. There was no outward display, no visible unraveling, but those present describe a shift subtle, yet unmistakable. A pause that lingered longer than expected, a response that did not come as quickly as it should have. For a man who has spent a lifetime preparing to answer every question with composure, this hesitation spoke volumes, because it revealed something rarely seen: uncertainty. Not about the role itself, but about how to explain it. How to translate something so deeply ingrained, so unquestioned, into words that a child could understand without feeling overwhelmed by its weight. And then there was the presence of Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose role in that moment, according to various accounts, was both quiet and essential. She is said to have stepped in gently, not to redirect the conversation, but to soften its edges. To offer reassurance where the reality might have felt too stark. Those close to the family suggest that she understands. Perhaps more than anyone, the importance of timing, of knowing when to explain, when to comfort, and when to simply be present. In that moment, her focus was not on the institution, not on the future, but on George himself. On ensuring that whatever he had begun to grasp did not become something that frightened him. Yet even with that intervention, the significance of the exchange could not be contained. Palace aides, often attuned to the smallest shifts in tone, would later describe the moment as defining. Not because of any immediate consequence, but because of what it represented. It marked a transition from unspoken preparation to conscious awareness, from passive acceptance to active questioning. And within the framework of the monarchy, that transition carries profound implications. Because once understanding begins, it cannot be reversed. It can be guided, shaped, even softened, but it cannot be undone. What makes this moment particularly striking is the realization that George is no longer standing at the edge of this world, he is stepping into it. Even if only in fragments. He is beginning to see that the crown is not just a symbol, not just a title passed down through generations. It is a responsibility that comes with cost, a cost that is not always visible, not always discussed, but deeply felt by those who carry it. And in asking his question, he has, perhaps unknowingly, begun to measure that cost for himself. This is where the emotional weight intensifies. Because for William, this is no longer an abstract future, it is a reality that must be explained, one step at a time. And for George, it is no longer a distant concept, it is something that is starting to take shape in his own life. The intersection of those two perspectives creates a moment that is both fragile and transformative. A moment where understanding begins, but clarity has not yet fully formed. And it is precisely this lack of clarity that gives the question its lasting power. Because it does not demand a simple answer. It cannot be resolved with reassurance alone. Instead, it lingers, echoing quietly, shaping thoughts and decisions in ways that may not be immediately visible. It becomes part of a larger process, a gradual unfolding of awareness that will continue to evolve over time. But the real shock wasn't the question itself, it was how it forced the future king to respond. There was no official statement, no carefully crafted royal response. Just a pause long enough for those nearby to recognize that Prince William didn't have an easy answer. In a world where every word is usually measured, refined, and delivered with precision, that silence carried an unusual weight. Those familiar with the rhythms of royal communication suggest that hesitation is rarely visible, especially in moments involving the future of the crown. And yet, this was different. Reports indicate that William's response did not come immediately, not because he lacked understanding, but because he understood too much. The question he had just been asked did not allow for a simple explanation. It demanded honesty, but honesty, in this context, is complicated. Because how do you explain a life defined by duty to someone who has not yet lived its cost? Insiders whisper that in that brief moment of silence, William was not just considering his words, he was confronting his own reality. The same reality he has spent years navigating, balancing expectation with personal conviction, tradition with a desire for something more human. And now, faced with the need to translate that experience into something his son could grasp, the weight of it became undeniable. Because any answer he gave would shape not just George's understanding, but his perception of the path ahead. Too much truth, and the burden becomes overwhelming. Too little, and the illusion risks breaking later with far greater force. This is where the internal conflict begins to reveal itself most clearly. William stands at a crossroads that is both deeply personal and profoundly institutional. On one side lies the instinct to protect, to shield his son from the harsher realities of royal life, to preserve as much of his childhood as possible. On the other side lies the obligation to prepare to ensure that when the time comes, George is not stepping into the unknown. Reports suggest that this tension has been building quietly, long before this moment, but the question brought it into sharp focus. It forced a decision that could no longer be delayed. What followed, according to those close to the situation, was not a definitive answer, but a conversation. A long, careful exchange that unfolded away from the immediate moment of impact. It is said that William chose his words with deliberate care, offering fragments rather than full explanations, guiding rather than instructing. Because the truth, in its entirety, cannot be delivered all at once. It must be introduced gradually, shaped over time, allowing understanding to grow without becoming overwhelming. And yet, even within that careful approach, there was an acknowledgement, subtle but unmistakable, that the path ahead is not optional. It is something that exists, regardless of whether it is fully understood. At the heart of this exchange was also the presence of Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose influence in these moments is often described as grounding, stabilizing, essential. Sources suggest that she played a key role in guiding the tone of the conversation, ensuring that it remained balanced, that it did not lean too heavily into either reassurance or reality. Her approach, as described by those familiar with her role, is one of quiet strength, offering comfort without dismissing the significance of what is being discussed. In a situation where emotions could easily become overwhelming, her presence helped maintain a sense of calm, a sense of continuity. But even with that balance, something had already shifted. The moment could not be undone. The question had been asked, the silence had been felt, and the conversation that followed had begun to reshape how George is being prepared for what lies ahead. Palace insiders suggest that this was not just a private exchange, it was a turning point. A moment where preparation moved from the abstract into something more immediate, more tangible. Because once a child begins to ask these questions, the approach to guiding them must change. It becomes less about shielding and more about explaining, less about preserving innocence and more about building understanding. And within that shift lies a deeper implication. Because if the next generation begins to engage with the reality of the crown in this way, questioning, reflecting, seeking clarity, then the methods used to prepare them must evolve as well. The old approach, rooted in quiet acceptance and gradual exposure, may no longer be enough. It may require a new kind of conversation, one that acknowledges both the weight of tradition and the need for personal understanding. That is what makes this moment so significant. Not because of what was said, but because of what was revealed. The silence, the hesitation, the careful words that followed, they all point to a deeper transformation taking place beneath the surface. A transformation that is not yet fully visible, but already beginning to shape the future in subtle, powerful ways. And in that silence, something changed not just for George, but for how the monarchy itself may move forward. Within days, subtle changes began to unfold. Not publicly announced, not formally acknowledged, but noticeable to those watching closely. Because inside the palace, moments like this don't fade, they reshape strategy. What had once been a gradual, carefully paced introduction to royal life now began to shift in tone and intent. Reports suggest that Prince George's exposure to the structure surrounding him became more deliberate, though never overtly intensified. It wasn't about overwhelming him, it was about guiding him with greater clarity. Small adjustments appeared first. Conversations that once remained general began to carry more meaning. Explanations became slightly more detailed, less abstract. Those familiar with the household's internal rhythm suggest that these changes were not sudden decisions, but quiet recalibrations, shaped by the realization that George was already beginning to connect the pieces on his own. Alongside this shift came a noticeable evolution in how he was being introduced to public life. Appearances that were once limited and symbolic began to take on a new dimension. Still controlled, still carefully managed, but with an added sense of purpose. Insiders suggest that each appearance was no longer just about visibility, it was about familiarity. About allowing George to gradually understand the role he is expected to inhabit, not as a distant future, but as something that is steadily approaching. These moments, while seemingly simple to the outside world, are believed to carry significant weight within palace planning, forming part of a larger strategy designed to ease the transition from childhood to responsibility. Behind the scenes, advisors are said to have begun re-evaluating long-term approaches, not through formal declarations, but through ongoing discussions that reflect a growing awareness of what has changed. Because when a question like George's enters the equation, it forces a reconsideration of timing, of method, of how best to prepare the next heir in a way that aligns with both tradition and the evolving mindset of a new generation. Palace administrative streams, often operating quietly in the background, are believed to have shifted their focus, less emphasis on distant preparation, more attention to immediate understanding. At the center of this recalibration remains Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose role has become increasingly pivotal. Sources suggest that she has advocated strongly for maintaining emotional balance, ensuring that any increase in exposure does not come at the cost of George's sense of stability. Her approach, as described by those close to her, is rooted in careful moderation, allowing George to grow into his role without losing the grounding that has defined his upbringing so far. This balance, however, is not easy to maintain, because with each step forward, the line between protection and preparation becomes more difficult to navigate. Meanwhile, Prince William is said to have become more protective than ever, though not in a way that restricts growth. Instead, it is a heightened awareness, a constant consideration of how each decision, each exposure, might shape George's understanding. Insiders suggest that William's own experiences have made him acutely sensitive to the pressures that can emerge too early, too quickly. And yet, he also recognizes that shielding his son entirely is no longer possible. The balance he now seeks is more complex: to prepare without overwhelming, to explain without imposing. What makes this moment particularly significant is the growing recognition that George is no longer simply observing, he is interpreting. Those within the palace suggest that this awareness has begun to influence not just how he is guided, but how the entire system around him operates. Because when the next generation begins to actively engage with its future, the dynamics inevitably shift. It is no longer just about maintaining continuity, it is about adapting to a perspective that is more questioning, more conscious, more aware of the realities behind the tradition. This awareness has quietly spread beyond the immediate family, reaching those responsible for shaping the monarchy's future direction. It has introduced a new variable, one that cannot be ignored or easily managed. Because if George continues to approach his role with this level of curiosity and reflection, it may require a broader adjustment in how the institution prepares its heirs. A shift not just in timing, but in philosophy. And while these changes remain largely unseen, their impact is already beginning to take shape. The palace, as it often does, is adapting, but it is doing so with a heightened sense of caution, aware that the implications of this moment extend far beyond the immediate present. Because once a shift like this begins, it does not simply settle back into place. It continues to evolve, to influence, to reshape what comes next. But while the palace adapted quietly, the implications of that question were far too significant to remain contained. For the first time, the future of the monarchy wasn't being shaped in council rooms or legal documents, it was being reflected in the eyes of a child trying to understand his place within it. There is something quietly transformative about that shift, something that those within the institution are beginning to recognize but have not yet fully defined. Because for generations, the monarchy has relied on structure, on carefully controlled transitions, on traditions that move forward with a sense of inevitability. But now, according to those who observe closely, a different influence is emerging. Prince George is not just inheriting a role, he is beginning to interpret it. And that distinction, subtle as it may seem, carries the potential to reshape how the crown evolves in the years ahead. Insiders suggest that George represents something the monarchy has not had to contend with in quite the same way before, a perspective shaped not only by tradition, but by a world that questions, that seeks understanding rather than simple acceptance. He is growing up in an era where information is constant, where expectations are shifting, where even the most established institutions are examined through a more personal lens. And within that context, his role becomes more than ceremonial. It becomes something that must be understood, not just fulfilled. This is where the generational shift begins to take form. Those familiar with the inner workings of the royal household suggest that the expectations placed on future heirs are no longer identical to those of the past. There is a growing awareness that continuity alone may not be enough, that relevance, connection, and authenticity are becoming just as important. And in George, that awareness is already beginning to surface. His questions, his reactions, his quiet attempts to understand what lies ahead, they all point to a mindset that is both rooted in tradition and shaped by modern reality. At the same time, this shift introduces a tension that cannot be ignored. Because the monarchy, by its very nature, is built on stability. It depends on the preservation of identity, on the continuation of values that have defined it for centuries. And yet, the world surrounding it is constantly evolving, pushing for change, for openness, for a more human connection to those who represent it. George stands at the intersection of these two forces. He embodies both the weight of history and the possibility of transformation. And navigating that balance will define not just his future, but the future of the institution itself. Public fascination with this next generation has only intensified this dynamic. Every appearance, every small gesture is observed with a level of attention that goes beyond curiosity. It reflects a deeper interest in what the monarchy will become, how it will adapt, whether it can maintain its relevance in a rapidly changing world. And within that scrutiny lies both opportunity and pressure. Because while the public may be drawn to the idea of a more relatable, more human monarchy, the expectations that come with that shift are far from simple. There are those who suggest that this moment represents the beginning of a more humanized approach to royal life, one where the individuals behind the titles are allowed to exist more openly, where their experiences are not entirely separated from their roles. And in George's case, that possibility is already beginning to take shape. His curiosity, his willingness to question, his effort to understand rather than simply accept, all of these elements contribute to a narrative that feels different from what has come before. It introduces the idea that the crown may not just be inherited, but examined. Not just carried, but understood. And within that idea lies something even more significant: the growing importance of choice. Not in the sense of rejecting duty, but in the way duty is approached. Because if the next generation begins to engage with their roles in a more conscious, more reflective way, it changes the nature of that duty. It becomes less about silent acceptance and more about deliberate commitment, a commitment that is chosen even if the role itself is not. This is the subtle transformation that is beginning to unfold. It is not dramatic, it is not immediate, but it is undeniable. And those who understand the monarchy's history know that even the smallest shifts can carry profound consequences over time. Because when the foundation of an institution begins to evolve, even slightly, it sets in motion changes that will continue to unfold long after the moment itself has passed. And perhaps that's what makes the moment so powerful. It isn't about what George asked, but what it revealed about what comes next. In the end, no official record will capture the moment Prince George asked his father that question. No document will archive it. And yet, those who understand the monarchy say it may become one of the most important turning points in its modern history. Because what lingers is not the exact wording, not the setting, not even the immediate response, but the effect it left behind. Those close to Prince William suggest that the moment did not end when the conversation did. It followed him. It stayed with him in the quiet hours, in the spaces where reflection cannot be avoided. For a man who has spent his entire life preparing for the inevitability of the crown, this was something different. It was not about fulfilling duty. It was about explaining it. And in trying to do so, he was forced to confront a truth that is rarely spoken aloud, that the role he carries is not just a position, but a burden that reshapes everything it touches. Reports suggest that this realization has begun to influence how he approaches the future, particularly when it comes to preparing George. Because preparation, as it has traditionally been understood, may no longer be enough. The next generation is not simply absorbing what is placed before them, they are engaging with it, questioning it, trying to understand its meaning before fully accepting its weight. And that shift, subtle as it may seem, changes everything. It requires a different kind of guidance, one that acknowledges not just the responsibilities of the crown, but the emotional reality that comes with it. That emotional reality has often remained hidden behind the formality of royal life. The public sees stability, continuity, a sense of unwavering purpose. But beneath that surface lies a far more complex experience, one shaped by expectation, sacrifice, and the constant balancing of personal identity against institutional duty. For William, this is not theoretical. It is something he has lived, something he continues to navigate. And now, faced with the task of guiding his son through the same path, he must decide how much of that reality to reveal and when. This is where the balance between legacy and individuality becomes most apparent. The monarchy depends on continuity. It requires each generation to uphold the values and traditions that define it. But it also exists within a world that is changing, where individuality is no longer something to be set aside without question. George, in his quiet way, has already begun to embody that tension. He represents both the weight of what has come before and the possibility of something slightly different. Not a rejection of tradition, but a reinterpretation of it. And within that reinterpretation lies a deeper understanding of what the crown truly represents. It is not simply an inheritance, not just a title passed down through generations. It is a responsibility, one that demands not only acceptance, but awareness. Awareness of its impact, its cost, and its significance in a world that no longer views such institutions with unquestioned reverence. This awareness, once it begins to take hold, cannot be undone. It shapes decisions. It influences perspectives. It quietly alters the course of what comes next. Those who study the monarchy often look for defining moments, events that mark clear transitions, that signal change in a way that can be easily identified. But moments like this do not announce themselves. They do not come with ceremony or recognition. They exist quietly, almost invisibly, until their impact begins to unfold over time. And by then, the shift has already taken place. The direction has already been altered. This is why, despite its simplicity, this moment carries such weight. Because it represents the beginning of something that cannot yet be fully seen. A gradual transformation shaped not by decree or decision, but by understanding. By the realization that the future of the monarchy may not lie solely in preserving what has always been, but in finding a way to carry it forward with a deeper sense of awareness. And perhaps that is the most profound change of all. Not a break from tradition, not a dramatic reinvention, but a quiet evolution, one that begins with a question, grows through reflection, and ultimately reshapes the way duty is understood. It is a shift that may take years to fully reveal itself, but its origin can be traced back to this single moment. A moment where the next generation did not simply accept its future, but began to ask what it truly means. Because sometimes, the future of a centuries-old institution doesn't change through power or protocol, but through a single question no one was ready to answer. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.